The concrete truck is here.
On the day of the pour, we had 4 people ready to work the concrete, and that ended up being a good amount. We were all really busy, and it felt like 4 people was kind of the minimum. It was ended up being a very busy and kind of hectic morning. As you'll see us working hard here as we go about this pour. The truck came fully loaded with 10.5 yards. That's the most the truck could carry, and we felt like we needed every bit of that in order to pour just this half of the footer. The forms are pretty deep, and there are some voids that needed to be filled, and so we were a little worried actually that 10.5 yards wouldn't do it. We ended up ordering the concrete from a place that had a good reputation. The only problem was they were about an hour away, and I didn't think that'd be a huge problem, so we went and ordered it from them. But when the truck got there, the concrete was already starting to, get a little firmer than we would have really liked it. So we started out with the difficulty of concrete that was a little bit sticky, a little bit firm. And so it just made the whole pour kind of a struggle. We got through it and it worked out okay. But, in retrospect, I think that the hour drive from the nearby town to us definitely gave the concrete time to set up and become slightly firm, which made the whole pour more difficult than it necessarily had to be. So from the beginning, we're trying to fill up these deep footers, and they're about 30 inches below the level of the form that you see on top of the ground, and then the form adds about another 10 inches on top of that. So you've got up to 40 inches of total depth that we're pouring. And, the width is varying from 12 to 16 inches. And so it's a pretty deep pour. There's rebar in there. And so we were using shovels to keep the concrete moving and kind of introduce some vibration so it would settle into the cracks and crevices and, fill up the trench without any, pockets. But that was all really, physical labor. There was about 3 of us working the trench with our shovels, keeping the concrete moving, trying to, get it to settle in and fill. And then there was one of us that was kind of tapping the sides of the forms with hammers and then trying to work it to smooth the concrete out with the level of the top of the form, because it was setting up really fast. And so the concrete was getting hard. As we're about maybe halfway down the length of the long side, the point at which we'd start pouring was already starting to set up and get hard. So we had to have someone working right behind the people that were filling the trench to level the concrete and try to get it kind of smooth because it was setting up really quickly. Towards the end of the pour, we had difficulty with the concrete setting up too much, and it actually got to the point where it wouldn't come down the chute, and it kind of got clogged up at the top before it comes down the chute. And so we had to really struggle to get it moving again, and we had to have the driver add water to the concrete mixture in order to get it to flow again so that we could finish the last of the footer. Once we finished with the footer, we did have some extra concrete, and we weren't quite prepared as far as what to do with that extra concrete. And so we ended up filling in a trench that I had dug that would be where a wall was going to be, and so it was like extra support under an internal wall. And so that was an okay use of the extra material. And then we also just kind of put it in the bottom of the trench in one area, which that did not work out great. And so in retrospect, that's something I could have done better, was prepare for the possibility of extra concrete that needed to be used. Once we finished the pour, we focused on getting the finish on the top of the forms as smooth as possible. Fortunately, it doesn't really matter since we're going to be pouring a aircrete wall directly onto the footer, so it wasn't critical that we got a smooth finish, but we were able to get it pretty respectable. The next thing was to cover the top of the forms in plastic so that we kept the moisture in the concrete. It's really critical to the strength of the concrete that it is kept wet for at least the first 7 days, and in fact a full 30 days would be ideal. And so in order to do that, instead of like spraying it down constantly, we just put plastic over it, which keeps the water from evaporating and works really well to keep the concrete wet until you remove the plastic and remove the forms. After giving the concrete some time to cure, we removed the plastic and started taking the forms off. Once we did this, you could tell that it started drying out substantially, in the sun. So you definitely want to wait long enough for it to cure before you remove the forms. Removing of the forms went pretty well, and as you can see, I had put rebar into the tops of the forms, and so it's the rebar is halfway down into the footer, and then half of it's sticking up above. And so that rebar that's sticking up is placed every 4 to 6 feet, and when we pour the wall on top of the footer, that will tie the wall to the footer and give the structure a lot of strength. Just went along the line here and finished removing the forms. 4x4 board that we had put on the inside creates a step that will delineate the wall from the floor, and in fact the pad will sit on top of that step right up next to the wall. So that's why we created that step there with the forms. As you can see, as we're removing these forms, we didn't get a perfect finish. We didn't have a vibrator to use. We were just kind of using a shovel to shake it and get it into those cracks and crevices and kind of tapping on the sides. Didn't leave a perfect finish. Fortunately, I don't think it'll be a big problem, especially due to our area. We live in the desert and there's actually no frost line here, which is, I know most people will find shocking, but officially the frost line in this area is 0 inches. I don't think water getting in and freezing will be a big issue for us here. Taking the forms off of the top, the main 2x4 forms off, was pretty easy. They all popped off pretty well. What was difficult was trying to get the blockades that are actually set down in the trench at the ends and at certain kind of cave-ins along the middle. Trying to get those boards out was really difficult, and so that took quite a bit of digging and finagling in order to kind of get those spots, get the forms out, but it turned out pretty well. I also did leave rebar coming out of the ends to tie into the next pour. So I put in quite a bit of extra rebar so that when I do the second half of the footer, there'll be lots of rebar to tie the 2 pours together. And then I also left a kind of a keyway in the ends to tie the 2 ends together there again when I make that second pour. And so hopefully that keyway will give it some extra strength as well. Once I finished removing the forms, I wanted to go ahead and do the grading while I still had the backhoe. So there were piles of dirt, all along the outside of the trench where we dug it out and piled it with the backhoe. And I wanted to use the backhoe to smooth that out and create the final grade and slope. And so the backhoe made quick work of that, and it looked a lot nicer, and it was nice to get that done while I had the backhoe. After I finished the grading on the half of the footer that we had done, the last thing I was able to do with the backhoe is finish spreading out the extra leach rock that we had. We had quite a bit of extra leach rock left over from the septic system, and I was able to just use the backhoe to spread that out and make kind of a driveway slash parking area in front of the house, and it actually ended up covering a nice big area, and so now we have a nice graveled parking area out in front of the house. My next step will actually be to install the plumbing in the underneath the pad before I put up the second half of the footer wall. Reason being is I need to run plumbing in and out of the footer wall, and I need to get all that set and in place before I pour the rest of the footer. So that's what I'll be working on next, is all the internal plumbing.